My name is Sandra Morgan. I am the Programs Manager here at Kennedy Lodge Long-Term Care. I am proud to introduce a Residents' Bill of Rights video. In Ontario, long-term care homes must follow the Fixing Long-Term Care Act 2021, which includes the Residents' Bill of Rights.
Welcome to our home here at Kennedy Lodge. Every resident matters. We have dignity, we have choices, we have rights.
Respect and dignity. Every resident has the right to be treated with courtesy and respect.
In other words, you have the right to be treated with politeness, dignity, and respect, no matter who you are. Every resident has the right to have their lifestyle and choices respected.
每位時刻均有權獲得對其生活方式的選擇尊重。話句話講，工作人員必須尊重你對院舍生活上做出選擇。
In other words, staff must respect the choices you make about how you want to live your life in the home.
參與決策，每名顧客均有權參與決策的決定。換句話說，你有權參與在院舍生活各方面的決定。
Taking part in decision making. Every resident has the right to have their participation in decision making respected. In other words, you have the right to be involved in decisions about all aspects of your life in the home.
Every resident has the right to freedom from abuse. In other words, no one is allowed to abuse you physically, financially, sexually, verbally, or emotionally.
Freedom from neglect. Every resident has the right to freedom from neglect by the licensee and staff. In other words, the owner and staff at the home are not allowed to neglect you.
每名住客均有权进行保密的沟通，接待自己选择的访客，并在不受干扰的情况下与任何人私下协商。换句说话，你有权实现与友人见面及交谈。
Every resident has the right to communicate in confidence, receive visitors of their choice, and consult in private with any person without interference. In other words, you have the right to meet and talk with people in private.
Friendships and relationships. Every resident has the right to form friendships and relationships and to participate in the life of the long-term care home. In other words, you have the right to make friends and to spend time with them. And you have the right to take part in activities at the home if you want to. For example, you may want to go to residence council meeting or take part in exercise classes, craft groups, or card games.
Share a room. Every resident has the right to share a room with another resident according to their mutual wishes, if appropriate accommodation is available. In other words, you have the right to share a room with another resident as long as you both agree on the space of the home. The person you share with could be your spouse, a friend, or someone you're having a romantic relationship with. It does not matter what their sex, gender, or whether you're married.
In Tennessee, every resident has the right to meet privately with their spouse or another person in the room to assure privacy. In other words, you have the right to be alone with your spouse or partner, or a person you want to be intimate with
親密關係。每位住客均有權在私隱得到確保嘅房間內，與其配偶或其他私人會面。換句話說，你有權和配偶、伴侶或你希望親密嘅人單獨相處。
Pursue interests. Every resident has the right to pursue social, cultural, religious, spiritual, and other interests, to develop their potential and to be given reasonable assistance by the license to pursue their interests and to develop their potential. In other words, you have the right to do things that interest you and are important to you inside or outside the home. Cultiver des intérêts. Le résident a le droit de cultiver les intérêts sociaux, culturels, religieux, spirituels et autres, développer son potentiel et d'obtenir une aide raisonnable de la part du titulaire de permis de CFA. En d'autres mots, vous avez le droit de faire des choses qui vous intéressent et que vous trouvez importantes à l'intérieur et à l'extérieur du foyer. Cléo, lorsque vous aménagez dans le foyer, vous pouvez avoir envie de continuer à pratiquer vos passe-temps, vos religions et d'autres activités qui vous plaisent. Sauf s'il y a une bonne raison de les interdire, le foyer doit vous permettre de poursuivre ces activités.
每名之客总有确处在恶劣和清洁的环境生活。我一句说话，你有权拥有一个清洁且恶劣的环境时刻。
Every resident has the right to live in a safe and clean environment. In other words, you have the right to have a clean and safe place to live.
每户住客均有權進入受享受的戶外或規劃，只享受戶外活動，除非物理環境不容許此行為。換句話說，你有權使用人社中的受保護戶外規劃，受享受大自然、新鮮空氣和戶外活動。
Outdoors. Every resident has the right to be given access to protected outdoor areas in order to enjoy outdoor activities, unless the physical setting makes this impossible. In other words, you have the right to use the home's protected outdoor areas to enjoy nature, fresh air, and outdoor activities.
在符合安全規定和其他住客權利的情況下，每名住客均有權在其房間內保存和展示個人物品、圖片和家私。換句說話，你有權將個人物品放在房間。
Personal possessions. Every resident has the right to keep and display personal possessions, pictures, and furnishings in their room subject to safety requirements and the right of other residents. In other words, you have the right to keep personal things in your room.
每名住客均有權管理自己嘅財務，除非該住客缺乏管理財務的法律能力。換句話說，如果你智力上有能力這樣做，你有權管理自己嘅財政。
Manage finances. Every resident has the right to manage their own financial affairs unless the resident lacks the legal capacity to do so. In other words, you have the right to manage your own money if you're mentally capable of doing this.
citizens' rights. Every resident has the right to exercise the rights of a citizen. In other words, when you move into a long-term care home, you keep all of the rights you have as a citizen. 公民權利，每名住客均有權行使公民的權利。換句話講，當你搬進長期護理院時，你保留作為公民所有的權利。
Proper care and service. Every resident has the right to proper accommodation, nutrition, care, and services consistent with their needs. In other words, you have the right to get the care and services that you need.
Know your caregivers. Every resident has the right to be told both who is responsible for and who is providing the residents direct care. In other words, you have the right to know who is looking after you.
Privacy during treatment. Every resident has the right to be afforded privacy in treatment and in caring for their personal needs. In other words, you have the right to privacy when you're getting or talking about personal care or medical treatment.
Plan of care. Every resident has the right to participate fully in the development, implementation, review, and revision of their plan of care. In other words, you have the right to be fully involved in your plan of care. This includes when the plan is being made, carried out, or changed.
Consent to treatment. Every resident has the right to give or refuse consent to any treatment, care, or services for which the consent is required by law and to be informed of the consequences of giving or refusing consent. In other words, when a doctor, nurse, or other health professional suggests a new treatment, they must tell you.
Every resident has the right to participate fully in making any decision concerning any aspect of their care, including any decision concerning their admission, discharge, or transfer to or from a long-term care home, and to obtain an independent opinion with regard to any of those matters. In other words, you have the right to take part in all decisions about moving into the long-term care home.
Health records. Every resident has the right to have their personal health information within the meaning of the Personal Health Information Protection Act 2004, kept confidential in accordance with the Act, and to have access to their records of personal health information, including their plan of care, in accordance with the Act. In other words, the law says your health and medical records must be kept private and confidential.
Support from caregivers. Every resident has the right to ongoing to seek support from their caregiver to support their physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being and their quality to life, and to assist them to contracting a caregiver or other person to support their needs. In other words, you have the right to give extra care and support from caregiver you choose. Mỗi名住客均有權獲得照顧者提供持續和安全的支援，以支援其身體、精神、社交和情緒健康以及生活品質，並有權獲得幫助以聯絡照顧者或其他人，以支援其 需求。換句話說，你有權選擇護理人員獲得額外的照顧和支持。
Bringing people to meetings. Every resident has the right to have any friend, family member, caregiver, or other person of importance to the resident attend any meeting with the licensee or the staff of the home. In other words, you have the right to ask people who are important to you to come to meetings.
家人參加會議，每位住客均有權讓任何朋友、家人、照顧者或其他重要的人出席與持牌人或護理院工作人員舉行的任何會議。換句話說，你有權邀請對你重要的人參加會議。
Designated contact person. Every resident has the right to designate a person to receive information concerning any transfer or any hospitalization of the resident, and to have that person receive that information immediately. In other words, you have the right to choose who the home must call.
Independence. Every resident has the right to receive care and assistance towards independence based on restorative care philosophy to maximize independence to the greatest extent possible. In other words, you have the right to get help, become as independent as you can be.
Restraint. Every resident has the right not to be restrained, except in the limited circumstances provided for under this Act and subject to the requirement provided for under this Act. In other words, you have the right to be free of restraint.
安寧療護理念，每位住客都有權根據安寧療護理念獲得照護與服務。換句話講，你有權接受照護和服務，幫助你擁有最充實的生活。
Palliative care philosophy. Every resident has the right to be provided with care and services based on a palliative care philosophy. In other words, you have the right to care and services that help you have the fullest life possible.
Visitors during critical illness. Every resident who is dying or who is very ill has the right to have family and friends present 24 hours per day. In other words, you have the right to have your family and friends with you when you are very ill or dying.
重大疾病期间的探访，每位临终或重病的居民都有全天候24小时有家人和朋友陪伴。换句话说，当你病重或临终时，你有权利让家人和朋友陪伴你。
Written policies. Every resident has the right to be informed in writing of any law, rule, or policy affecting services provided to the resident and of the procedure for initiating complaints. In other words, you have a right to be told in writing how to make a complaint about problems in the home, and the home must tell you in writing about any rules you're supposed to follow.
住客會，每位住客都有權參加住客會。換句話說，你有權參加住客會，每間長期護理院都必須要住客會。只要長期護理院喺住客才能成為住客院會員，而且只要住客才能參加會議。 的事物參加聚會，所有人下聚合，均為社會委員。
Resident Council. Every resident has the right to participate in Resident Council. In other words, you have the right to take part in the Resident Council. Every long-term care home must have one. Only the residents of the long-term care home can be members of the Resident Council, and only residents can attend the meetings. Every resident in the home is considered a member, even if you don't go to the meeting.
Raising concern. Every resident has the right to raise concerns or recommend changes in policies and services on behalf of themselves or others to the following persons and organizations without interference and without fear of coercion, discrimination, or reprisal, whether directed at the resident or anyone else. In other words, you have the right to speak freely. No one is allowed to punish you for speaking out or making a complaint.
你可以告知他們你的擔憂，提出申訴，或是你們希望院舍你的改變。如果有人因你對院舍提出投訴以懲罰你，那你將係非常嚴重的事。如果發生呢種情況，你應該立刻報告。
Here at Kennedy Lodge, we respect the rights of every resident. This is your home, your dignity, your voice, and your rights.
Our home, our rights. Together, we are one family.
ما با هم یک خانواده هستیم.
इकट्ठे हम सब एक है.
Insieme siamo una famiglia.
我們同在一起就是一家人.
Asisari perwar ha. Sama-sama tayong iisang pamilya.
Pamoja sisi familia moja.
我們行對之體就是一家人.
અમે બધા મળીને એક પરિવાર છીએ.
Juntos somos una familia.
Ensemble nous formons une grande famille.